O God, make your spirit and guidance be in us as we work for the benefit of all our people, for peace and justice in our land, and for the constant recognition of the dignity and aspirations of those whom we serve. Amen.
Thank you. Good morning, everyone. Start with minister statements. Minister responsible for finance.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I rise today to provide a fiscal update, and in doing so, I also want to speak about one of the most valuable economic resources that exists across the whole of the Northwest Territories: resiliency. The world remains in the grip of a pandemic, the likes of which few people alive in the world today have any reference point to. Canada is currently experiencing a second wave. In the Northwest Territories, we are fortunate that since the start of the pandemic, we have been able to limit the cases of COVID-19 that have entered our borders. But that comes with a cost. Travel within the territory remains tightly restricted, and as a result, many sectors of our economy continue to be seriously impacted. This follows on several months of lockdown or near lockdown earlier in the spring. I would venture that no household in the Northwest Territories is untouched by the COVID-19 pandemic. Similarly, there is likely no business or industry that has not faced or does not continue to face financial or human resource challenges. Many households, businesses, employers and employees are stressed, scared, or both. That is the reality of the times we are in. Mr. Speaker, the Northwest Territories has a strong history of resiliency. The climate is harsh, but people have thrived here since time immemorial. Costs of living are high, but people come and grow their families here. And the cost of doing business is high, and yet we do continue to attract investment. A lot has changed since the budget speech in February. Budget 2020 spoke to the importance of working within our means by finding internal efficiencies and using creativity and innovation to deliver our mandate priorities, even in a time of slow economic growth. The need for innovation and creativity is more pressing than ever, but in the current context, we must start from a place of resiliency to put innovation and creativity to the test. Despite all of the pandemic-related upheaval, the core values we are using to deliver fiscal responsibility to the Northwest Territories have not changed. We will still work within our means to deliver not only on the priorities of the 19th Legislative Assembly, but also to ensure that people and communities across the Territory are healthy and safe. We continue to seek creative solutions to these wholly unexpected challenges. We strive to strike a balance between all of the many diverse needs that exist. Fortunately, we will start with some good news. Signs of an economic recovery are appearing. Our job market has recouped many of the resident jobs that were lost. The labour participation rate has climbed back to its March level, and the employment rate has partially recovered. Retail sales are rebounding, with the Northwest Territories outperforming the provinces so far this year. And this consumer spending is supported by stable and high average weekly earnings. We are painfully aware of sectors in the economy that are still in serious hardship, but we are cautiously optimistic that we will have a 90% job recovery to pre-pandemic levels by the end of the calendar year. Our own revenues will drop this year. We are forecasting significant corporate income tax and resource revenue declines, as the events of 2020 will likely continue to some degree through 2021 and work their way through the economy. It is simply not possible to give direct financial support to every person or business in need all at the same time. But from the earliest days of the pandemic, we made efforts to immediately support Northwest Territories people, businesses and communities by waiving a number of revenues, including airport fees, bridge tolls, and leases, which will result in a decrease in our projected revenues. Despite these revenue losses, our fiscal situation remains stable, thanks in large part to two facts. We have received $92 million in immediate and very welcome support from the Government of Canada to address the expenditure challenges caused by the COVID-19 pandemic. And in addition, territorial formula financing provides a mainstay of fiscal support that will respond to current own source revenue losses in future years. As a result of the new federal support, we are currently projecting this year's fiscal revenues to be $2.2 billion. That's $38 million more than what was estimated in the 2020-2021 budget. That said, the pandemic has driven expenditures significantly higher as we implement measures to protect Northwest Territories residents and provide economic support. In total, we estimate $170 million in new expenditures for emergency measures, including additional healthcare costs, income assistance, and other various forms of economic relief and supports for people, businesses, and communities. To better sustain our delivery of the crucial programs and services we have implemented to protect the Territory from COVID-19, we are proposing this sitting to bring these existing functions together under a COVID-19 coordinating secretariat that will help us better meet demand, ensure more efficient use of the GNWT's fiscal resources, and provide a clearer point of accountability for the ongoing implementation of the public health orders. With respect to COVID-19 costs, the Department of Finance will publish cost information on its website to maximize transparency. Regardless of how we deliver the pandemic-driven activities, all these expenditures will have a material impact on our fiscal bottom line. We are planning for the worst while hoping for the best, and we are including the projected costs of $175 million by the end of this fiscal year in our updated forecast for this year. Even within this, we have tried to find efficiencies and innovative delivery methods, and to strike a balance between all of the many needs created or contributed to by the realities of the pandemic. This response includes $31.7 million that would otherwise be spent across departments coming into the COVID-19 Secretariat as, again, a single point of accountability and administration. $72 million for other related healthcare costs, such as testing and supporting healthcare system capacity, $72 million for economic supports, including the foregone revenues. Taking the $92 million in direct federal support into account, the projected net effect of the COVID-related expenses and costs is expected to be $83 million. Although these costs are not good news, the GNWT has a track record of fiscal responsibility, as demonstrated again this summer when Moody's Investors Service confirmed our AA1 credit rating for the 14th consecutive year. Past financial responsibility will help us weather the pandemic's revenue and expenditure shocks in our medium-term fiscal outlook, and we are committed to continuing on this track. This commitment will require work. Our latest medium-term outlook projects a course which, if not adjusted, results in both an operating deficit in 3 years and exceeding the new borrowing limit. Despite a $1.8 billion borrowing limit, our current path will start the next Legislative Assembly in violation of that limit. Resilience is not an accident. It must be consciously sought and developed through diligent effort. We are paying for our COVID-19 pandemic response by shrinking our operating surplus, not by increasing debt and not by increasing taxes. The 2020-2021 operating surplus is projected to narrow a full $143 million from the February 2020-2021 budget to $60 million. This reduced position could impact our longer-term fiscal sustainability. But it is a response that should allow for short-term cushioning, and as a result, hopefully, more long-term resilience within our private sector. The lower operating surplus will also increase our total debt to a projected $1.262 billion by the end of this fiscal year. Had we not successfully negotiated a $500 million increase to the federally imposed borrowing limit, this level would have been unacceptably close to the previous limit. Although the new $1.8 billion limit will provide $538 million in borrowing capacity at year-end, we need to be conscious of the risks of carrying too much debt. COVID-19 is not an excuse. We must focus on the difficult choices we need to make to live within our means while providing the programs and services that Northwest Territories residents need, especially within the context of COVID-19. During the budget dialogues that I held through the summer, we heard loud and clear that spending reductions are preferred over tax increases. By themselves, increasing revenues will not be sufficient and is frankly unlikely to be fruitful in the short term as the pandemic continues to impact markets across Canada and the world. Continued borrowing will be fiscally unsustainable, and letting capital assets deteriorate by starving our capital budget is unacceptable. The reality is that expenditure management will need to be the main pillar in moving the GNWT onto a sustainable fiscal path. But I want to be very clear. Expenditure management is not the same as expenditure reduction. The budget dialogues participants gave considered suggestions for better expenditure management to improve our efficiency and find more value for our dollar. Now is the time to be creative and innovative. There is a path forward that will allow us to budget in a way that reflects the values and priorities of the people of the Northwest Territories, and that will have to be our fiscal path. Last, Mr. Speaker, during the budget dialogues, I also heard many thoughtful comments from people making connections between health and productivity, between education and labour market participation, and between economic growth and government revenue growth. I believe underlying much of what we heard is evidence that we are truly pulling together as a territory. This energizes me with optimism that we will show resiliency, we will rebuild and provide a legacy for the future to realize the great potential that this territory offers. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you, Minister. Minister statements. Minister statements. Member statements. Member for Hay-River South.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, addictions has a devastating impact not only on individuals but on families and the community as well. It is a difficult and sensitive issue, one that is hidden in the background, quietly discussed, provided some support, but never appears front and center. In the past several months, Hay-River has had to deal with several events that include the tragic loss of local residents. The community has seen the hospitalization of others due to overdose and vehicle accidents brought on by alcohol and drugs. When events such as these happen, we immediately look to lay blame in order to deflect responsibility from ourselves. We try to remove it from what we consider mainstream society, when in actuality it is interwoven in the very fabric of society and we tend to normalize it. Mr. Speaker, I recognize and admit that I have limited knowledge in the area of addictions. However, I do understand that drug addiction, no matter what walk of life you are from, does not care who it harms or what agony and grief it causes individuals and families. I have met with people who have drug addictions, those experience mental health issues due to drug use, those families personally impacted, and medical staff dealing with persons detoxing. I strongly believe addictions needs to be brought to the forefront and provided resources to seriously address it. Mr. Speaker, this government is providing some financial resources to address addictions, but knowing that this government has no issue identifying $87 million to address COVID monitoring and enforcement when no one has died in the NWT, but is slow to act when it comes to dealing with a disease that is hospitalizing, killing, or destroying our family and friends, our family members on a regular basis. I find this to be a travesty. This disease does not work in a vacuum. To fuel itself, it takes advantage of peer pressure, lack of housing, unemployment, mental health issues, personal trauma, effects of residential schools, and other realities. Because of this, I expect and look to this government to take a cross-departmental approach to address it. We must look for and action real solutions that work for the people of the NWT. Mr. Speaker, I do not want to see another mother or father having to experience the death of a child because we are not doing enough to support the treatment of addictions. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you, Member for Hay-River South. Member statements. Member statements. Member for Ditchell.
Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, the Northwest Territories has a growing demographic of people whose voices are often not heard nor adhered to. This demographic is the elders or knowledge keepers. Mr. Speaker, in my Dene culture, we say to the young to respect the elders, as the young do not know what the knowledge keepers have experienced in their lifetime. Many have experienced hardships in their lives in providing for their families, but have prevailed in some way, and they have always had comforting words to soothe away any pains others may be going through. There's a term coined that best describes what one does not know of them. Do not criticize a knowledge keeper unless you have walked a mile in their moccasins. Mr. Speaker, one of the mandates of this Assembly, as identified, is to assist the elders to age in place, that is to stay in their own home and in their home community. Mr. Speaker, the families do not want to see their knowledge keepers leave the community to be placed into a home in another community, a place where they are in a totally strange environment that they did not grow up in. Most of all, away from their families, the very people they have nurtured all their lives, and we must not forget the many grandchildren that are left behind. And far too often, the children and grandchildren do not get to spend time with the knowledge keepers, who in time will pass, and for all that we know, they may have been lonely for family and aching to be in the community they call home. Mr. Speaker, I will have questions for the Minister of Health at the appropriate time. Masi.
Thank you, Member for Decho. Member statements. Member statements. Member for Tlabatcha.
Mr. Speaker, since getting elected last year, I have assisted my constituents with a wide range of different issues, spanning all of the major departments of the Government of the Northwest Territories. By far, though, Mr. Speaker, the one department I have dealt with the most has been the NWT Housing Corporation. In fact, I would estimate that roughly 90% of all my constituent concerns involve housing. Mr. Speaker, I have noticed a concerning trend regarding housing in the NWT, particularly public housing. I am seeing a trend of mistreatment to vulnerable people, specifically for seniors and low-income people. As an example, just in the last 2 weeks alone, I've dealt with 3 constituents who are facing potential eviction from their rental units, 2 of whom are seniors. At the time during a global pandemic and with winter upon us, these sorts of actions by the Housing Corporation are unacceptable and must stop immediately. Furthermore, Mr. Speaker, I've also tried to help several constituents find more suitable housing for their situations. However, I continually always get a response back stating that the client's income is over the core net income threshold, as per NWT housing policy. Anyone with an income above the core need income threshold is considered to have sufficient income to address their own housing needs, thus ineligible for any NWT housing programs. Again, Mr. Speaker, this type of policy is not acceptable in its current form because people are falling through the cracks and are being adversely affected as a result. This policy, therefore, must be re-examined and changed because it's causing more harm and more headaches for long-term residents of the NWT, especially my constituents of Tlabatcha. Mr. Speaker, another major issue with this minister and her department is the lack of communication from emails I've sent to her about my constituents, along with my concerns as an ordinary MLA regarding awarding of contracts that were done by the RCMP Contract Homes. In the last budget, there were funds allocated for 2 public housing units to be built in Fort Smith, which were not awarded, and contracts did not go out. I asked the minister about this verbally and through email and still have not received an answer. I am concerned because there's major housing needs in Fort Smith. What happened to the allocations of these funds for these 2 units? Mr. Speaker, in conclusion, there are major communication gaps within the NWT Housing Corporation and things have got to change. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you, member for Tunade-Wilde, Kabacha, sorry. Member statements, member for Nuvik-Tune Lakes.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, we continue to see violence against our Indigenous women and girls, not just here in the North, Mr. Speaker, but across Canada. We have all seen recently over this time since we've been during this pandemic, the loss of a young Indigenous woman from Yellowknife, as well as another young woman murdered in Hay River. Outside the NWT, an Indigenous woman and a mother of 7, Joyce Eshquan, who went to the hospital to seek medical treatment, instead died while being treated like no person should be treated in a facility like that. Mr. Speaker, in June, we were informed that an action plan to deal with the calls for justice had been delayed by the federal government, and in fact, it's my opinion that no substantial work has been done to the National Action Plan to this date. And Mr. Speaker, we have also heard that due to COVID restrictions in place, domestic and sexual violence has surged during the pandemic. The NWT has even received increased federal funding for its shelters to assist with this recently. During our last session, I asked this government to take the lead and develop an action plan, not wait any longer to give action to the calls for justice outlined in the Missing and Murdered Indigenous Women and Girls final report. We need to do this now and not wait any longer. We cannot have any more stolen sisters. Today, Mr. Speaker, I will be asking the Minister responsible for Status of Women questions on what progress has been made on developing our own NWT action plan. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you, member for Nuvik-Tune Lakes. Member statements, member for Frame Lake.
Merci, Monsieur le Président. On April 17, 2020, the federal government announced $1.72 billion in financial assistance for the remediation of orphaned and inactive oil and gas wells in Western Canada as part of Canada's economic response plan for COVID-19. On May 28, I made a statement in this House about the potential for the NWT to access similar funding, working in partnership with Yukon and Nunavut. The Premier provided some assurance that, quote, remediation from mine sites has always been a priority, end of quote. The Premier also said that a joint letter was in preparation to federal ministers from the 3 Northern Territories to advocate for such funding. Mr. Speaker, I've seen that letter, and it is a request for support for the mining industry, with mention of an accelerated funding for northern contaminated sites buried on page 3. What I have learned since is that there does not appear to be a clear lead for our government on this file, no specific asks, and little coordination. To repeat what I said in May, the federal contaminated sites inventory shows 1,647 sites in the NWT, with an estimated assessment remediation cost of $12.375 billion. The GNWT 2018-19 public accounts show a total of 285 sites under our jurisdiction, with a cost of remediation estimated at $70.6 million. Our Premier needs to make this work a priority as part of our efforts on economic recovery and part of the emerging remediation economy here in the Northwest Territories. There are obvious links to NWT Indigenous economic development businesses and the proposed Polytechnic University. Billions of dollars will be spent on environmental remediation at Giant Mine, Norman Wells, and numerous other sites. In many ways, we are pioneering new technologies, approaches, and partnerships that should be the envy of the circumpolar world and form a central part of the Polytechnic University. There will be jobs created in many of our smaller communities and regional centres. Later today, I'll have questions for the Premier on whether she will make it a priority to secure federal investment for accelerated remediation of contaminated sites as part of our drive towards economic recovery and diversification. Merci, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you, member for Frame Lake. Member statements, member for Tunade-Wilde.
Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I want to point out that during my constituency visits, I noticed some common themes in terms of gaps in our healthcare system. In particular, dealing with the elders and mobility restricted individuals who needed medical assistance. And I'm happy my colleague from DECHO mentioned helping our elders age in place with dignity. And it kind of follows in what I'm about to say. So, Mr. Speaker, I want to give this visual to you. If you could picture yourself as an elder in a small community, as an elderly individual who might not have English as a first language, and you have an immediate health issue, and you need to be assessed in your home. If you are in a small community, you'll be told you'll need a relative or the RCP to get you to the local health center. This is a problem. What happens if you, in this situation, are unable to call out to emergency services, i.e. an ambulance? Or unable to get a hold of a relative to get you to a healthcare center? If I could just get you to turn to your pieces, I want to say a few words in Chippewa. You know, if you're a nurse and I'm an elder, I'm in trouble, I say, you know, if I tell you, my nurse, Satiya, Sukotaya, no, Satanaya. How do you respond to that? That's something to think about. If there's a language barrier there, and that's my other point, where am I going with this, Mr. Speaker? Needs to fill some very glaring gaps in our small communities in terms of response for ambulatory services. Some of these issues, in my opinion, can be addressed by easily beefing up home care and CHR staff. And with that, Mr. Speaker, I want to commend our new health minister on addressing some of my immediate concerns that she and our staff have already addressed since taking on her new role. However, my constituents do have legitimate concerns that do need answers, and I'll have some questions for the health minister at the appropriate time. Mr. Speaker.
Thank you, member for Tuna-Day Willow-Day.
Great sleeve.
NWT 911 has answered almost 14,000 emergency calls. These calls have come from every one of our NWT communities, even the smallest and most remote, such as Jean Marie River, Wati, and Ulahaktak. What's more, NWT 911 has dispatched emergency services not just to NWT communities, but also to other jurisdictions such as Vancouver and Edmonton, even as far away as the Baltic states. Mr. Speaker, we have all heard about 2 babies in Yellowknife and the 1 baby in Inuvik that 911 personnel helped to deliver. But due to the various privacy laws in the NWT, the public never really hears about the lives 911 helps to save, the real impact of emergency medical and fire services dispatched through 911. I can tell you one story of a community member who would have died slowly and alone without 911. One foggy day, the person had a serious car crash on a low-traffic road about 30 kilometers from the nearest community. The driver was so badly injured that they had to be medevaced to Edmonton. The driver had happened to connect their cell phone to the car for hands-free calling and to listen to a favorite playlist. This action saved the driver's life because automotive telematics do not call 111 or 2222, and cars are programmed to call 911 in the event of a bad crash. In this case, the car called 911. Let me say that again. The crash was so bad and the driver was in such poor condition that the car called 911. I can tell you that 911 was able to send help and talk with the driver, who was in a state of shock, for several minutes before the driver lost consciousness. The 911 dispatcher stayed on the call for 12 minutes longer before losing connection. Had 911 not been an option, that driver most certainly would have perished in that crash. Mr. Speaker, imagining being a 911 dispatcher, answering calls from people in distress, the worst calls possible, for 12-hour shifts. Most of the time, the dispatchers do not know what happens to the patient once the first responders arrive. The call is done, 911 hangs up, and the dispatcher goes on to the next emergency call. Imagine not knowing what happened to that stabbing victim you told how to stop the bleeding, that parent you taught to administer life-saving drugs to their overdosing teen. Mr. Speaker, I seek unanimous consent to finish my statement.
Thank you. Members seeking unanimous consent to conclude their statement. Are there any nays? There are no nays. You may conclude your statement.
That parent you taught to administer life-saving drugs to their overdosing teen, or that caller you walked through providing CPR to their family member for 23 minutes straight when first responders were already on another call. Did those people survive? Mr. Speaker, I am truly worried about 911 dispatcher burnout. Only 5 staff are funded, so there is only one 911 dispatcher on duty per 12-hour shift, answering over 60 calls a day. The MedResponse program dispatchers who are to provide support to 911 often are too busy on their own calls or don't have dispatchers on shift. As a result, the 911 staff have to do a lot of extra shifts or double shifts. At times, 911 has been so short-staffed that the dispatcher on duty doesn't get meal or break times and has to run to the bathroom hoping a call does not come in. The last government, desperate to get 911 costs below the $1.70 per month subscriber fee, cut everything possible from the budget, even relief staff. The 911 program was directed to come back after the first 6 months of operation with a budget based on actuals, not projections. Mr. Speaker, NWT 911 did return with a zero-based budget, asking that only for 2 more staff, relief funding and systems funding. The program would operate with a total of 7 full-time dispatchers. This right-sizing of the 911 budget was rejected by Finance, as 911 had not been operational for at least 1 year. As such, 911 continues with only 5 dispatchers, 1 dispatcher per shift. Besides answering 911 calls, 911 dispatchers dispatch a Nuvik ambulance and Norman Wells Fire, do officer safety with highway patrol, issue public safety alerts, monitor sea, land and air emergency radio frequencies, and take 811 calls. That's right. When callers dial 811 and press number 5, they are connected to the 911 dispatcher providing an 811 scripted script. Mr. Speaker, it's almost shameful. The COVID-19 811 Secretariat has 9 operators, 3 nurses, 4 relief positions, and 1 manager position. They do not provide service 24 hours a day, 365 days a year, as 911 does. According to my constituents, callers can never get through to anyone, and I know that because I've called myself on somebody in my yard. Well, unless they press number 5 and get the 911 dispatcher. In fact, some community chiefs have called the 911 emergency line simply to get through for someone for answers because they could not get through to anyone at 811. Mr. Speaker, I will have questions for the Minister of MACA about why this government continues to undervalue and underfund the 911 service, a service that has clearly saved NWT residents' lives while free-flowing funding to COVID 811. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you, Member. I know the importance of the topic, so I let you go on longer than usual, but in the future we'll short supplementary extension there. Okay. Next, member statements. Member for Cam Lake.
Mr. Speaker, the majority of my constituents supported the swift responses of the Chief Public Health Officer that prioritized our safety in the face of a largely unknown virus. Today we know more and know that our responses need to be sustainable as COVID-19 has no end date. My constituents are becoming increasingly frustrated as COVID cases surge in the South and our COVID communications and policy implementation still struggle. The announcement of the COVID Secretariat wasn't well received. We've been told there are 150 staff members, most of which are GNWT employees on transfer assignments, of which 131 are frontline staff working with Protect NWT, Border Enforcement, 811, and isolation centres. These positions have largely been filled since April and May, and the projected first-year cost is $31.7 million, an additional cost of $2.6 million compared to previous COVID response efforts. Mr. Speaker, the safety of Northerners is paramount. And so far, we have been lucky. We have not lost Northerners to COVID. But this year, we have lost Northerners to suicide, addictions, interpartner violence, and illness. So I want to remain conscious that we not become tunnel visioned by COVID while our real demons demand more funding. Today, COVID is still a global threat, but we remain accountable for a fiscally responsible government, so I ask that COVID Secretariat be both responsive to Northerners' needs and fiscally responsible, and that we remember that this is an opportunity to build a sustainable model for any future state of emergency. In doing so, I expect that the COVID Secretariat, 1, be collaborative by working with local business owners to be fiscally responsible, and moreover, empower business owners to act as COVID safety ambassadors. 2, be consistent with fair and consistent policies to triage volume to protect NWT. 3, be sustainable. Isolation centre policies must be reviewed to curb misuse as they are our greatest cost. And 4, communicate. I commend departmental communication staff, but clear, consistent, proactive public communication needs to extend to all levels of government during a continued state of emergency. Mr. Speaker, I don't have the difficult job of deciding appropriate risk for the NWT, where over a quarter of our population is considered high risk. But I do know that my constituents want to be empowered and informed to support fair COVID rules and restrictions, and that our collective responsibility to build a fiscally responsible and responsive prepared government. Thank you.
Thank you, Member for Cam Lake. Member statements, member statements, member for Mumphrey.
Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker,
Mr. Speaker, we have COVID-19 but since there will be a secretariat created with 150 employees at the cost of $86 million, and I want to say a few things regarding that.
the Premier launched a COVID Secretariat with 150 new positions at a cost of approximately $87 million to date to the people of Northwest Territories. Contrary to the spirit of consensus government, the Premier has done so without consulting with members on this side at the initial stage, Indigenous governments, nor the general public, and also business sector as well. Mr. Speaker, the Secretariat diverts scarce resources from the 22 former priorities of the 19th Assembly, including such major objectives such as universal child care, increasing student education outcomes, increasing affordable housing, expanding the economy, reducing the cost of living in the Northwest Territories, increasing economic diversification by supporting growth in non-extraction sectors, reducing the cost of power, and increasing the use of alternative and renewable resource energy. Mr. Speaker, the NWT's initial pandemic response right from the get-go, which utilized existing GNWT personnel working within the home departments, has proven very effective. The government's new COVID Secretariat abandons this proven cost-effective approach in favor of a new burdensome bureaucracy that promises no improvement, Mr. Speaker, at a vastly increased expense. So, Mr. Speaker, with that in mind, I will have questions for Premier at a later time. Merci.
Thank you, Member for Mumphrey. Member statements, member for Yellowknife North.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. If there's one constant in the modern economic history of the Northwest Territories, that is monopolies and foreign ownership, whether it be Northmart, Northview, or Northwestel, or sometimes it's Chinese state-owned entities and American billionaires. However, Mr. Speaker, I believe that tide is starting to turn, and it is being led by our Indigenous-owned businesses. It is often said that government should not be in the private sector and should not be in the business of business. And I believe that. However, there is an exception for our Indigenous governments. Built into many of their land claims are preferential contracting and procurement clauses. They have our Indigenous development corporations, their private arms, are some of the largest private employers in the Northwest Territories. Much of our GDP flows out of this territory, and we fail to capture the resources. So the more we can do to support Indigenous businesses in capturing the GDP, that is a good thing, Mr. Speaker. However, Mr. Speaker, we have failed to do that. We presently do not have an Indigenous procurement policy. We as a government have often failed to capture and uphold those land claim clauses. Federal contracting allows non-competitive processes for Aboriginal businesses. However, we have failed to lobby the feds to make sure such contracting follows those guidelines. Our internal free trade agreements make exceptions for Aboriginal businesses. And the protectionist inclinations of many of us in this House are limited due to those free trade agreements, but not for Aboriginal-owned businesses, Mr. Speaker. There is much room to grow, and hopefully those Indigenous-owned businesses can capture more of our GDP. Mr. Speaker, the last census data showed that 50% of Indigenous residents had a job, compared to 80% of non-Indigenous residents. Our Indigenous developing corporations and businesses naturally prioritize hiring Indigenous people. Additionally, when they are successful, they don't pack up their headquarters and move south because they are inherently in it to support Northerners and support Indigenous people. Mr. Speaker, I will have questions for the Minister of Finance about how we can implement a proper Indigenous procurement policy to capture more of our GDP and grow our Indigenous businesses to truly have a Northern economy for Northerners. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Here. Member statements. Member statements. Member for Nahende.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Sharon Grace Perreault was born in Fort Good Hope on January 12, 1962, to John Baptiste Gully and Alice Masuni. Sharon lived with her mother Alice until her brother got sick at the age of 5. Then she moved to live with her dad in Fort Good Hope, or Coville Lake. She lived with her dad until she reached the age of 8, when her father moved Sharon and her sister back to Fort Good Hope to attend school. Each summer break, she would be taken out of this Fort Good Hostel and return home. She attended school in Fort Good Hope until June of 1997. Then she went to school in Inuvik in 1979. Sharon and Ronald Perreault married in September of 1986. They have 5 children: Darren, Lisa, Matthew, Kelsey, Terrence, and 5 grandchildren. Sharon did various jobs in the community to support her children, including teaching in the school and working with the Keshnugutni Band Office. Sharon and Ronald fostered many children, and this helped Sharon decide that she wanted to make a difference. She moved to Fort Smith to take the social work program. With a diploma, she worked as a corrections officer, a probation officer, and Native Customs adoption officer for the Sault-II. In 2009, Sharon was diagnosed with breast cancer and fought it to beat it. In 2010, she was victorious in this battle. After the battle, she decided to go to Coville Lake to be a haul truck driver. After a while, she decided to pursue her career goal and become a child welfare officer in Fort Good Hope. In 2017, she took a job in Fort Simpson as a child welfare officer, where she mentored a number of new graduates, ensuring she passed on the knowledge she had for the betterment of the children under her care. Sharon embraced her culture. Sharon could sew, hunt, trap, and do whatever necessary to live on the land. She wanted to teach those around her the importance of keeping our culture alive. She loved being out on the land, and she said, "That is the place you heal and find yourself." She was no stranger to hard work. She empowered those around her and encouraged those to use their voice for change if they wanted it. Sharon was the person that encouraged people to be kind, good to one another, and be there for those that needed help. She stressed we do not know what a person is going through. On May 9th, 2019, cancer came back. Through this battle, she was fearless and courageous, and she stayed positive throughout. Continuing to be selfless, preparing those around her for what may come. Her body succumbed to the disease, but her spirit and mind did not. To the very end, she fought. But in Sharon's word, "I cannot wait to see what heaven looks like. It must be beautiful. I get to see my parents and those who left before us. I can celebrate with them. She'll be sadly missed." Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you, Member for Nahende. Our thoughts and prayers are with the family. Member statements. Member statements. Returns to oral questions. Returns to oral questions. Recognition of visitors in the gallery. Recognition of visitors in the gallery. Acknowledgements. Acknowledgements. Oral questions. Member for Thabacha.
Mr. Speaker, in response to the COVID-19 pandemic, the Northwest Territories Housing Corporation issued a public announcement stating that all evictions from rental housing units will not be carried out unless there is a significant matter involving risk to other tenants or the NWT Housing Corporation's buildings. My question is, will the Minister consider amending this policy to mandate a freeze on all evictions in the NWT until this pandemic has ended? Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you, Member for Thabacha. Minister responsible for the Northwest Territories Housing Corporation.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and thank you to the member for bringing this forward. As the Minister for the Housing Corporation, I take this very seriously when we're looking at the evictions for our residents of the territory. But dealing with COVID-19, we have to take precautions as well too, and looking at the safety for the residents of our people that are occupying our units. For the eviction notice, it does go through a lengthy process. But this is something that I will be bringing back to my department, and we are currently working on how are we going to be working with our clients who are ready for eviction or who have been through the process for eviction, because they are given last chance agreements as well too, but we will be reviewing that. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you, Minister. Oral questions. Member for Thabacha.
Mr. Speaker, my next question requires clarity on how responses are given to constituents. Will the minister consider changing the policy for how her department deals with constituents who are receiving threatening letters of eviction, letters of last chance, and treating our seniors and low-income people disrespectfully and undignified? Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you, Member for Thabacha. Minister responsible for housing.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and thank you, member, for bringing this forward. Client service is a priority of the Housing Corporation, and it's something that I've been working with very strongly and acknowledging our client service at the LHO and at the district level as well too. We are looking at also providing training and client service training opportunities for our employees. And also looking at the evictions and the process, and also working with the elders as well too. And but safety is a priority as well too for the Housing Corporation. We do deal with a lot of low-income families, and they do come with very unique situations that the Housing Corporation's got to work with, and we take each file considered of all of the situations that may come with those files. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you, Minister. Oral questions. Member for Thabacha.
Mr. Speaker, there seems to be a communication gap between the Minister's office and the local housing authority regarding threatening letters of eviction and last chance letters. Will the Minister ensure that the local housing authority follows the direction of the public announcement in Fort Smith? Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Member for Thabacha, Minister responsible for housing.
Mr. Speaker, and thank you for the member for the question as well too. I will be providing the member with the process that we do follow that lead up to eviction, just to provide clarity as well. And I will be working with my department, and I appreciate the comments coming forward. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you, Minister. Final supplementary, member for Thabacha.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, can the Minister give me a timeline for when I can expect replies to my outstanding emails and inquiries? Specifically, the status of the RCMP housing contracts and the 2 public housing units that were supposed to be built in the 2020-2021 fiscal year. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you, member for Thabacha. Minister responsible for housing.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and thank you, member. The RCMP housing units in Fort Smith, 5 out of the 6 are currently under construction by the local Fort Smith contractors, and it's to be completed in 2021. The 6 units will be tendered in February 21 and should be completed in 2021, the fall of 2021. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you, Minister. Oral questions. Member for Inuvik-Twin Lakes.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, my question is for the Minister responsible for Status of Women. Will the Minister update this House if there has been any progress made on the development of an NWT action plan? Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you, member for Inuvik-Twin Lakes. Minister responsible for the Status of Women.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Yes, Mr. Speaker, I'm very happy to be able to report back to the House. The Special Advisor, Sabet Biscay, who I want to acknowledge for all the work that she's done as a one-woman person really running that office. She has gone out and we've hired a local consultant, Mr. Speaker. That person has a deadline of October 16th, by which point we'll have a work plan. It's been very clearly instructed on my behalf that the work plan is meant to be one that involves tremendous engagement at the front lines across the Northwest Territories. And once I have that work plan ready, I'll be sure to share it with the members. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you, Minister. Oral questions. Member for Nuvigton Lakes.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I'm really happy to hear that there is some progress being made. Can the minister explain or give a little bit of a timeline that we should be seeing this work plan and possibly leading into an action plan? Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you, Member for Nuvigton Lakes. Minister responsible for status of women.
Mr. Speaker, obviously when that work plan comes to me, and I expect it'll be coming to me at some point later today, I do intend to get it turned around so the MLAs and all members of the House will have an opportunity to see it and look at it. It's our expectation that once the plan is approved, which again does certainly involve some collaboration and communication with the members here, once it's approved, we're estimating 4 to 6 months in order to have a draft of the action plan. That time frame, the reason for that extension of time, or that extended time, really is because, again, this has to be something that is driven by the communities, by the residents, by those who are involved on the front lines, and I want to ensure we have enough time to do that and to involve that engagement. So again, subject to exactly when the final work plan is approved, which is, again, due imminently, then in 4 to 6 months thereafter. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you, Minister. Oral questions. Member for Nuvigton Lakes.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and thanks to the minister for that. And I'm going to be looking forward to that in 4 to 6 months. My question is to the minister: is how is this going to be kind of infiltrated into the department so that way we know when we look at the calls for justice that it kind of filters into all different areas of the GNWT, that the GNWT would be responsible for actioning? Can the minister just kind of say how this direction is being provided? Thank you.
Thank you, Member for Nuvigton Lakes. Minister responsible for the status of women.
Mr. Speaker, this is truly a whole of government opportunity, and there are a number of departments that are all engaged in terms of a GNWT working group. And there's been much discussion amongst the departments as well around really re-examining how we deliver services that are aimed at vulnerable sectors and aimed at women specifically. And I do think there will be some movement on that also over the next 4 to 6 months, where we can really see a concerted effort and a more organized effort. It's been part of what, as departments go through business planning and then prepare their main estimates and budget for next year, that is exactly part of the conversation we're having. So I am hopeful that as we move forward to our next rounds of budgets and main estimates, that the member will see that there is a reflection there of this becoming a true whole of government opportunity. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you, Minister. Oral questions. Member for Nuvigton Lakes.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I don't have any more questions, but I just want to say thank you to the minister for taking this seriously, for taking the calls serious, for listening to the families. And I'm looking forward, and I'm sure the families are looking forward to how this government is going to protect our women, girls, and our two-spirited, queer, lesbian, QIA. There you go.
Thank you. I'll take that as a comment. Oral questions. Oral questions. Member for Frame Lake.
Merci, Monsieur le Président. My questions are for the Premier, who is responsible for federal relations. In my statement earlier today, I noted the potential for literally billions of dollars of federal investment across the Northern Territories as part of an accelerated program on contaminated sites, remediation and economic recovery. It's not clear that my call for action was taken seriously in May. Does the Premier see this as a major opportunity for federal funding transfers? And if so, tell us who is actually in charge of this work and how it's going to be coordinated across several departments. Merci, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you, Member for Frame Lake. Honourable Premier.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'd like to direct that to the lead department, which would be the Minister of ITI. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Okay, Minister responsible for Industry, Tourism and Investment.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, this is certainly a priority that has been made very clear to me. I'm happy to give some further update as to what has happened in the intervening months. There was a conference with the Energy and Mining Ministers of Canada at which some of the national level work that's occurring was discussed, and an awareness that given the funding that's now on the table from the federal government, there may be some shift in those priorities or a reorganizing of those priorities. What we're doing here as a response to that, and seeing that that was out there, I immediately sought to have a conversation with the 3 territorial ministers and did so approximately 2 weeks ago. And I did so in preparation for a call that the 3 territorial ministers were having with Minister O'Regan just yesterday. I think my time sense is getting a bit off, Mr. Speaker, but this week had that call with Minister O'Regan. The call with the 3 territorial ministers spoke about this issue. It affects the Yukon and here, but the Nunavut minister as well was engaged. Our call with Minister O'Regan, we raised this issue. And Mr. Speaker, I had also had my own call with Minister O'Regan where again I raised this issue. And Mr. Speaker, I also sent a letter to Minister O'Regan just a couple days ago on October 14th, focused entirely on exactly this issue, on how the Northwest Territories is going to have access to this stream of funding, how we're going to participate in this area of stimulus. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you, Minister. Oral questions. Member for Frame Lake.
Merci, Monsieur le Président. I want to thank the Minister for that update. The joint letter that I saw on a pan-territorial approach, the issue of an accelerated contaminated sites program was buried on page 3, and it was really dressed up as support for the mining industry. I'm worried that GNWT will simply see this federal support as a way to lessen the public liability we failed to prevent from the bankruptcy of Strategic Oil and Gas, Cameron Hills, and similar boondoggles. So what assurance can the Premier give me that there is a real vision and concrete proposal for an accelerated Northern Contaminated Sites remediation program with federal investment? Merci, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you, Member for Frame Lake. Minister responsible for ITI.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, there certainly is a vision for this project. We do recognize most certainly that typical well abandonment in the southern provinces costs far less than what well abandonment reclamation will here in the Northwest Territories or in the North more generally, whether that's particularly because of access and the need to transport supplies. There is also significant environmental risk here, again, with climate change being on the front lines of the Northwest Territories. And so there's a real clear awareness that this is an area where we need to take significant attention. In addition to that, Mr. Speaker, we're also certainly well aware that there's a lot of coming opportunities for remediation economics here in the Northwest Territories. And if we can have access to this stimulus funding now, that will help ensure that people are being trained and given experience with more experienced reclamation companies so that they're ready to take on those opportunities as they go forward. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you, Minister. Oral questions. Member for Frame Lake.
Merci, Monsieur le Président. I want to thank the Minister for that. Leads very nicely into my next question. So in my statement, I referenced that literally billions of dollars are going to be spent on remediation at sites like Giant Mine, Norman Wells, and across the Northwest Territories. And I think that there's some enormous opportunities here to build a remediation economy that includes training, apprenticeships, research, and more. And all of that, of course, should be linked to the Polytechnic University. So can the Premier tell us whether our government has made that link between federal investment in an accelerated contaminated sites program and the Polytechnic University? Merci, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you, Member for Frame Lake. Minister responsible for ITI.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I'm happy to say that yes, we have made that link. Obviously, I think the Premier was prepared to take the question, Mr. Speaker. But it's because there is an overarching direction that's going on this. I've had the opportunity to speak very briefly with my colleague, Minister Simpson from EC&E, and I believe it's out in the public well known already that mineral resources and environmental management is one of the pillars of Polytechnic going forward. So certainly the fact that there's that link has been made between ITI, where we can provide those opportunities in the industry, EC&E, where they can provide those opportunities in training, and of course then with federal engagement, if we can have access to this opportunity, all of those links are now, I believe, quite actively being made. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you, Minister. Oral questions. Member for Frame Lake.
Merci, Monsieur le Président. I want to thank the Minister for that. I too provided my own links and comments back to the Minister in terms of those areas of specialization for the Polytechnic University. But I guess what I want to speak about now is really that we still have a long way to go as a government to prevent further public environmental liabilities. We of course want to make sure that the polluter pays principles honoured, and that current operators do not use an accelerated contaminated sites program to subsidize or replace their own obligations. So can the Premier provide any assurance that our government will finally take action to prevent further public environmental liabilities and fully implement the polluter pays principle for federal investment in an accelerated contaminated sites program? Merci, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you, Member for Frame Lake. Minister responsible for Industry, Tourism and Investment.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Again, this is an opportunity to demonstrate the whole-of-government approach. The polluter pays principle is certainly a foundation of the modern environmental assessment and regulatory regime that we have here in the Northwest Territories, and that is something where ITI, in terms of our involvement with the mineral resource sector, is aware of, and something where the Department of Finance is also involved in terms of being constantly monitoring of those who are providing securities. And of course, it is departments of environmental, natural resources and lands who work closely to determine an accurate amount of liability to ensure that in fact the GNWT would be protected against the need for remediation liabilities should that fact arise, and that the companies that are performing their work here are adhering to all of those requirements, again with that foundation simply being that the polluter would pay. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you, Minister. Oral questions, member for Great Slave.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I have questions for the Minister of MACA about the lack of transparency by this government related to the actual operation costs of the 911 program. The 18th Assembly placed a fee cap of $1.70 per user per month for 3 years, regardless of the program costs. Will the Minister be open and transparent and provide the 2020 actual costs to the members? Thank you.
Member for Great Slave, Minister responsible for Municipal and Community Affairs.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The annual report for the operations of the NWT 911 program will be tabled during this session. This includes the operation cost for the NWT 911 during the first 6 months of operation. The delay in tabling the report is targeted towards the public safety, being solely focused on COVID-19. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you, Minister. Oral questions, member for Great Slave.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. One of the 19th Assembly's priorities is to reduce the cost of living for the residents of the Northwest Territories. Will the Minister guarantee that the GNWT will subsidize the zero-based budget of NWT 911, keeping the call-answer levy at no more than $1.70 for the life of this Assembly? Thank you.
Thank you, member for Great Slave. Minister responsible for MACA.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The NWT 911 Act includes provisions to cap the call answers levy at $1.70 for the first 3 years of operation of the system. We are just entering into the second year of operation, so no change to this fee will be made prior to 2022-2023. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you, Minister. Oral questions, member for Great Slave.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, will the Minister agree to properly fund the NWT 911 before funding the COVID 811 service? When will 911 be funded correctly so that the staff are not burnt out, doing double shifts, missing meals and breaks, and potentially compromising the services residents need in case of emergency? Thank you.
Thank you, member for Great Slave. Minister responsible for MACA.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The NWT 911 service and the COVID 811 service are operated in 2 different departments for 2 totally different purposes. And according to the budget of these programs are developed independently. These are both important services to residents that need appropriate resources. The 811 service and the COVID agency is under the authority of the Premier. I will not comment on the funding for the program beyond saying that it is important and I do support it. The department is adding additional terms and relief staff to the dispatch centre to support existing staff. And I also wanted to include that stress management training is also offered, and the quiet rooms and fitness machines alleviate to alleviate stress. Online and phone therapies are available. Peer-to-peer support through Alberta Critical Incident Network, and one-on-one counseling for the following critical calls and support from the medical professionals to intervene on particular trauma calls. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you, Minister. Final supplementary, member for Great Slave.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, will the minister commit to advocating with the Premier so that the funding for 911 that's not being provided properly is not spent on COVID 811 or NWT Protect? Thank you.
Thank you, member for Great Slave. Minister responsible for MACA.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I will have a conversation with the Premier in regards to the COVID-19 and the 811, and I will follow up with the member. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you, Minister. Oral questions. Oral questions. Member for Hayer South.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, recently I talked to the sister of the young lady who was murdered in Hay River a few weeks ago. The sister I talked to is also married to my nephew. This shows you how we can all be impacted by events. She understands her sister is gone, and she is looking for answers to ensure something positive comes from her sister's death. She requested that I ask the Minister of Health what supports are available for young adults between the age of 18 to 30 who may be fighting addictions or drug use, as there appears to be a support gap in that age range. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you, member for Hayer South. Minister responsible for Health and Social Services.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Thank you for the question. I realize that it's very difficult for families to come to terms with deaths due to addictions, especially in young people, and it happens much too often. For the 18 to 30 group, they would have access to all the same resources that adults have. So those include things such as counseling, the opportunity to go to facility-based addictions, the opportunity to come back and use on-the-land services and other kinds of peer supports. So there is a full range of services outlined in the Mental Wellness and Addictions Recovery Plan that was tabled in 2019 that are applicable to all residents of the NWT. Thank you.
Thank you, Minister. Oral questions. Member for Hayer South.
Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I had the opportunity to go through some of the government websites, and I noticed that there's quite a few toll-free numbers you can access to get support. So I'd ask the Minister, can she confirm how many calls are received on support lines, and how many of these calls are from Indigenous peoples, how many are from others, how many by community, and how is it determined if services provided by these toll-free numbers are actually working? Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you, member for Hayer South. Minister responsible for Health and Social Services.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I appreciate that the member was able to give me this question in advance because there's quite a detailed answer to provide. So the Department of Health and Social Services operates the NWT helpline. It's available 24/7, and that could be for counseling, it could be for referral. There are a number of different functions. The helpline calls are anonymous, so people choose how much information to disclose, such as their ethnicity, their age, the community of origin, and so on. But I can tell you that in 2019, there were 697 calls to the helpline, 46% identified as female, 52% identified as male. Approximately 55% of callers disclosed their ethnicity, and of that number, 19% identified as Indigenous. As I mentioned, people do not have to disclose where they're calling from, but the data says that 50% of callers identify as being from a rural community, which I would say in our context is a remote community, and 30% from an urban area. So because the calls are anonymous and the service is immediate, there isn't a program of follow-up with callers to see whether they have additional questions. It would be on the caller to call the line and ask for additional help. Thank you.
Thank you, Minister. Final supplementary, member for Hayer South.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. For the people in the NWT, and I guess maybe I'm thinking about myself as well, is the more personal face-to-face meetings are usually preferred over telephone or video conferencing, and I guess a lot of people are just used to that. Can the minister confirm if the department has statistics on the preference clients have on how the services are provided? What are the most successful methods? Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you, Member for Haver South. Minister responsible for Health and Social Services.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and thank you to the member for Hay River South. Every 2 years, the department conducts a satisfaction survey related to the community counselling program, and it looks at a lot of different things: cultural safety, respect, access, how effective the services were. We have discovered, as you said, that people do like face-to-face services, but what we really had as an overarching message from the last survey is that there's no one-size-fits-all. Some younger people prefer the phone apps, others prefer face-to-face encounters, and others are content to be on the telephone. What I want you to know is that this is something that we track regularly, and the outcome is customer satisfaction. That is to say, the people who phoned or have reached out for help feel that they've received effective help. Thank you.
Thank you, Minister. Oral questions. Oral questions. Member for Ditcho.
Merci, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, my member's statement spoke at length of our knowledge keepers and the life they have lived in their communities while passing on their knowledge of the land to the next generation of their families. This Assembly recognizes the need to keep the knowledge keepers to age in their communities and at the same time to keep their dignity as human beings. Mr. Speaker, my community of Fort Providence currently has an abandoned former health centre building that would make an ideal long-term care facility for our elders. We can also make space for people with severe disabilities and offer other programs such as New Day program, which targets male offenders of a partnership. Just to note, there are two separate entrances. So there's two separate areas of the health center and also a basement unit. My question to the health minister is, will she make a commitment to turning this building into a long-term care center for our community? Merci.
Thank you, Member for Ditcho. Minister responsible for Health and Social Services.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I'm going to take that question on notice as I don't have any specific information about the condition of the Fort Providence Health Centre. Thank you.
Thank you, Minister. Oral questions. Member for Ditcho.
Mr. Speaker, it seems that only the larger centres get all the services and buildings, including victim shelters, family violence centres, sobering centres, homeless shelters, and the list goes on. Can the health minister make a commitment to look at instituting a small-sized long-term care centre in Fort Providence? Merci.
Thank you, Member for Ditcho. Minister responsible for Health and Social Services.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, long-term care facilities are for people who need complex medical care from nurses 24 hours a day. They are people who have needs that are beyond families to provide. As a result of the level of care required, these facilities are located in regional centres, and that is a place where there is a broader range of services available and also a greater number of staff who can work with the elders. I realize it's important to keep elders in their communities, but I also realize that in order to provide them with the care they need for their own quality of life, it may not be possible to do that in the community until the end of their lives. Thank you.
Thank you, Minister. Oral questions. Member for Ditcho.
Merci for that, Minister. Mr. Speaker, it saddens me to know that this government can spend huge sums of money on large ticket items that are not a priority for members on this side of the House. Every time a small community wants to offer programs that the larger centres offer, they are shrugged off, making large excuses of, oh, you need qualified people. Well, those qualified people can be relocated or new positions created in the small communities to accommodate so that we can have this programming. Nope, we can't have something that will stimulate our much-needed local economies. That will include creating much-needed jobs. Can this Minister of Health begin the process to providing all the small communities with the much-needed programs offered by the large centres so our residents do not have to flock to the regional centres? Merci.
Thank you. Member for Detroit, Minister responsible for Health and Social Services.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and thank you for that question. It is a priority of this government to help elders to age in place, and there are many things that need to be lined up in order to make that mandate commitment a reality. One is housing, that people have housing that is suitable and affordable for them to live in. The second is that we have a robust home and community care program that can visit more able adults in their homes and provide them with personal support worker services. So that could be things like driving the elder to an appointment, it could be cleaning their oven, it could be taking them grocery shopping. It's whatever the elder needs to be able to stay in place. So there is a drive now to expand the home care services to better define what is being offered and where it's being offered. But underpinning all this work is the commitment to help elders age in place, and that's where we're at. Thank you.
Thank you, Minister. Final supplementary, member for Detroit.
Merci, Mr. Speaker. As I've been going on about our elders, or knowledge keepers, to keep them in our communities, this is so that the children, their children and grandchildren and other residents of the community can have direct access to them within the community without having to drive out of town or to another center. Because they go to another center, and you've got to understand from their point of view, the elders, the ones that are displaced into another center, that they don't have family around. They're in a totally strange environment. They've never ever left the community. That's the Dene people. They know the people, they know the land. They have all their traditional foods available to them right in their community. It's something that, I'd really encourage you to look at instituting into the small communities to help more. I know you're saying, oh, we got home care services and everything. That's just not enough. It's to house them into some centers in the community where they can be looked after, and we can hire specialized people to do the care for them. I'd really encourage the minister to start looking at institutions, such programs for all the small communities in the north must see.
The member for Detroit, Minister responsible for Health and Social Services.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I take that comment.
Thank you, Minister. Oral questions. Member for Trinidad-Welde.
Yeah, Mr. Speaker. And I had some questions for the Minister of Health and Social Services, and I'll give some context here. Just listening to some of the comments and hearing my colleague from Detroit, and there's a clear picture here. There's some gaps here in our care for our elders, and I gave that visual earlier in my member statement, and there's some gaps here, and I think that we need to really step back and start looking at some of these issues, and we got to find whatever ways we can, let our elders live in their homes, and in a lot of our small communities, we look after our elders. We get we have relatives that come and check on our elders quite often and whatnot, but to get some of those specialized care, there's a gap there. So I guess my first question to the minister is, if an elder is ill in their homes, what is the policy for local nurses on home visits? Mr. Jones.
Tunde Weldy, Minister responsible for Health and Social Services.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, the nurses in the health centres don't make house calls. Thank you.
Thank you, Minister. Oral questions. Member for Tunde Weldy.
Yeah, that is concerning. I know there is some safety in terms of protecting our healthcare providers, like our doctors and nurses, for doing home visits, but there is still a need. My second question, there are a lot of our small communities, there are no ambulance services. So what does this department do to deal with patients who need emergent care? Mr. Jones.
Thank you, Member for Tunde Weldy, Minister responsible for Health and Social Services.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and thank you for that question. It's not the role of Health and Social Services to provide ambulance services. That's under the Department of Municipal and Community Affairs. I'm assuming that community members drive one another to the health centre, and that's probably the most common practice, and I hope that that would still be the practice. In the event that somebody doesn't have a ride close to hand, that person should call 911 and ask them for help to get to the health centre. Thank you.
Thank you, Minister. Oral questions. Member for Tunde Weldy.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And again, this picture is starting to get a little more clear for me now, and I think it's important that the Minister of Health and Social Services and MACA do work together on these type of issues. I think it's important. Like I said, there are a lot of our small communities, a few are on the floor someplace and in trouble. You know, it's going to be tough. You'll probably have to get a relative or the RCMP to bring you to get the emergent care. So that's something to think about. My next question for the Minister is, what proactive measures is this department taking to dealing with patients who need health care in their homes? Mr. Jones.
Thank you, Member for Tunde Weldy, Minister responsible for Health and Social Services.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and thank you for the point that we should be working together. I completely agree. What we're doing about home care is that in June of this year, the Minister of the time tabled the Home and Community Care Review, and it made 22 recommendations for improving home and community care in the Northwest Territories. A number of recommendations have been accepted and implementation work is underway. Some of the other recommendations are dependent on other program evaluation, like the paid caregiver program. So what we're doing here is trying to I'm going to say rationalize home care so that there is a clear set of services that are provided, that these services are available more widely than they are now, and that the service is provided in more hours than it is now, so that it's not just a Monday to Friday 9 to 5 service, but that there's some flexibility to help people, for example, get to bed in the evening, which they probably don't want to do at 5 o'clock. So we are attempting to make home and community care more effective for people to age in place. That's our ultimate goal. Thank you.
Thank you, Minister. Final supplementary, Member for Tunde Weldy.
Mr. Chair, Mr. Speaker, and then that's good to hear there are some measures being put in place. But like I said, you know, there's these gaps. We still need to keep talking about them. We're still hearing them. I know you're new in your role, and already we've got you recognized quite a few times already. But it just goes to show that there are some really glaring areas of need, like yesterday. So, but my final question. I think just from looking at things, I think home care nurses might be a good starting point in our small communities. And I know in my home community of Denis-Nicoya, we do not have a home care position per se. So would the Minister commit to creating a home care nurse position in Denis-Nicoya?
Thank you, Member for Tunde Weldy, Minister responsible for Health and Social Services.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, the situation in communities without home care is that the community health nurse is the person who provides the home care in default. The allocation of resources is really dependent on the number of clients and the types of needs they have. So the allocation of home care services is something that the department is working on. And so depending on the age profile and need profile of people in your community, it may be necessary to assign additional resources, but I can't make that commitment today. Thank you.
Thank you, Minister. Oral questions. Member for Yellowknife North.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. As I spoke earlier today in my statement, the government of Nunavut has an Indigenous procurement policy. The government of Yukon is developing one. Alaska's Business Development Corporation has done amazing work in this field. And for some reason, despite having constitutionally protected land claims with procurement clauses in them, we have not developed a comprehensive Indigenous procurement policy. So my question for the Minister of Finance is, will we develop an Indigenous procurement policy? Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you, Member for Yellowknife North. Minister responsible for Finance.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I fully expected a question was going to come about this in the course of this session. Short answer, Mr. Speaker, is that this is going to be part of the procurement review. Slightly longer answer, Mr. Speaker, is that I want to make sure that it's clear that we will be doing this in conjunction with the Indigenous governments who have those rights and in their land claims agreements. So yes, it's coming, but it's going to be coming and it's going to be done the right way, which is in consultation with the Indigenous governments. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Good, Minister. Oral questions. Member for Yellowknife North.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Yeah, and I fully expect this work to be done in consultation with both Indigenous governments, whether they have that clause, and Indigenous-owned businesses. I recognize this is a large piece of policy work, but can I get a sense of when we expect that work to be completed, Mr. Speaker?
Thank you, Member for Yellowknife North. Minister responsible for Finance.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I have a stronger timeline with respect to the more general procurement review that is scheduled to take place. That right now, work is happening to finalize a discussion paper around procurement, and not just procurement generally, procurement, negotiated contracts, northern manufacturing policies, BIP. All of that is going to be subject to this discussion paper, which will be coming out this month or next month, with a review to engaging in public consultation, and engagement across the board with those participating in the business area, with Indigenous governments, with the public. My expectation is that will produce some recommendations by March with a view to having some changes ready to go by June. Now, that does not necessarily mean that the Indigenous procurement policy will follow that exact timeline, but that will be part of what's happening there, and I'll be able to give a better update on where that's at. Again, once we begin that engagement, simply again giving myself, quite frankly, the leeway to acknowledge that when we're engaging with Indigenous governments, I'm not necessarily going to set that timeline unilaterally. That timeline has to be set partly through that process of engagement, but we are well underway to taking those steps. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you, Minister. Oral questions. Member for Yellowknife North.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I look forward to that work, and I recognize the complexity, and I hope we can get most of this done by June, because we're about to pass hundreds of millions of dollars in capital, and every year we wait and we have not refined our procurement process, more of that money will flow down south. One of my concerns with this is that a lot of our contracts are 75-cent dollars. They have federal conditions in them. Some of our bigger projects, such as Giant Mine, are purely federal contracting, and I don't think this government has worked to lobby the federal government to make sure we are capturing and putting proper northern benefits into the federal procurement process. So can I get a confirmation from the minister that this work will include a strategy for capturing federal procurement as well? Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you, Member for Yellowknife North. Minister responsible for Finance.
Mr. Speaker, I don't want to get captured with semantics. Being conscious of the fact that we have to be engaged with the federal government when we put forward any kind of procurement policy, and particularly an Indigenous procurement policy. So the answer to that is yes. Whether it's going to be a specific federal strategy, I guess I'm a little more hesitant to say. But Mr. Speaker, I believe the Premier has already spoken at other occasions about the fact that we are all tasked with being responsible to go to our federal partners and counterparts to discuss all of these kinds of issues. So what I will say is, Mr. Speaker, I'll perhaps commit to providing a better update on exactly where we're at and engaging with the federal government on procurement. It is happening. I'm just hesitant to call it a strategy, but we can be more concerted in our efforts and more clear about those plans. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you, Minister. Final supplementary member for Yellowknife North.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. This government and its mandate has a number of very large capital projects on it. It's the Slave Geological, Tulston, Mackenzie Valley. We saw a P3 which had a good start to Aboriginal business in its contracting. But my concern here is also Giant Mine, which is largely federal run. So can I get the Minister to provide an update on perhaps there's a way to speed up this work and put a little bit more of a focus on Indigenous procurement and northern benefits for our major infrastructure projects? Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you, member for Yellowknife North. Minister responsible for finance.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I've actually asked that exact question about what can be done to speed the work up. What I can say, Mr. Speaker, is that we are right now, as well as producing the discussion paper, we're also producing the work plan of how this will roll out cross-departmentally with all of the different departments that are involved. And one of the steps that I have asked that we take is to, in that work plan, make the process one where we will be in control of the timeline and able to pull those levers to ensure that the timeline, at the very least, stays on track, but ideally can move forward quickly. And Mr. Speaker, I do have some areas where I'm hopeful that before the end of this calendar year, we'll see a few changes to procurement that we can enact even before this takes place, at least in an interim basis. So yes, Mr. Speaker, we're doing everything we can to advance this and accelerate it. Thank you.
Thank you, Minister. Oral questions. Oral questions. Member for Kamloops.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, my questions today are for the Premier in regards to the COVID Secretariat. The isolation centres in the Northwest Territories take up 54% of the budget, the total budget, of the COVID Secretariat. And so what I'm wondering is, given that the isolation centres are by far the highest cost, what is being done to mitigate this? Thank you.
Thank you. Minister responsible for the COVID Secretariat.
There's a variety of things that we're looking to do with this. We are, of course, making sure that we're working closely with the Chief Public Health Officer regarding her orders and where she goes with that. That all impacts on our isolation units. But there are things we're doing. We're looking at perhaps if we can contract out the services, and if that potentially has the potential for better service and for cost savings. So sometimes that happens. We're also looking at, because we do have, not a lot, Mr. Speaker, I want to clarify, but a few people that use our isolation centres fairly regularly, and so we're looking at how we can decide what we should be paying for, what are mandatory, for example, medical travel, and what aren't mandatory, and how we'll address those. So those are discussions we're just beginning, and you will find that we'll provide to Standing Committee when we've concluded our results. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you, Premier. Oral questions. Member for Kamloops.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'm happy to hear that, because although, yes, things like medical travel are absolutely a requirement for the government to help out with, there is some misuse of the isolation centres happening in is an expense that is just really unaffordable for the people of the Northwest Territories. I did hear the minister responsible for the COVID Secretariat speak lightly on contracting out services, and I'd like to find out more information about what the COVID Secretariat is looking at contracting out to local businesses around the Northwest Territories. This not only increases the GDP in the Northwest Territories, but it also creates safety ambassadors across the Northwest Territories when we're educating and informing and empowering people to help us do the work of safety in the Northwest Territories. Thank you.
Thank you, Member for Kamloops. Honourable Premier.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The COVID Secretariat actually houses a number of functions. It houses our border controls. It houses our enforcement for the COVID-19, for the CPHO orders. It houses 811 and Protect NWT, our isolation units, and our PPE for anyone that's non-health, our schools, our NGOs, our municipal and Indigenous governments. So we are looking at to see if we can contract some of those pieces. We have recently identified a local warehouse provider for that has the potential to hold our PPE inventory. So that is one area we're looking at. We're also looking at, I know that we've gotten questions on the floor about the border in, down south or Smith Hay River area, Providence, so we're looking at how we can actually perhaps contract out some of those services. There are areas, though, that we have to be very careful in contracting out. For example, our enforcement. Enforcement usually comes with a set of qualifications, skills. It's a very technical piece, so you don't want just anyone showing up at people's doors. Not very good idea. We did hear about safety before already, so that is some of the concerns. So at this point, we're not looking at contracting out our enforcement services. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Premier, oral questions. Member for Kamloops.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. I was happy to hear from the Minister responsible for the COVID Secretariat that there is an effort being made to contract services and supplies from northern businesses. What I'd like to just stress to the Minister responsible is perhaps also finding ways to use our businesses involved in manufacturing in the Northwest Territories and making sure that they have the opportunity to bid on any form of a contract that comes through. My next question, Mr. Speaker, is in regards to policies. I hear frequently from constituents, and probably the thing that they're most frustrated about is inconsistencies or inequities between policies and a feeling of unfairness between who policies apply to and who they don't apply to. I hear frequently from businesses and also constituents that they're frustrated by the disjointed communication between the health and safety, the rules, and the government operations around COVID. So how can the Premier speak to how the COVID Secretariat is going to address these and is going to make changes to better serve the people of the Northwest Territories? Thank you.
Thank you, Member for Kamloops. Honourable Premier.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Again, one of the major issues that we had and why we wanted to bring it under one agency, the Secretariat, was because the components were all in different departments, and sometimes the right hand wasn't keeping the left hand aware of what was going on. So under the Secretariat, it does bring it into one area, and so that we are on track and we all know what's going on working together. Communications within the Secretariat, we have 3 positions, I believe, that were in that, and so you will see, because before communications were spread between every department, and again it was an issue. So with the Secretariat, you will see that with we'll have a better communications getting out there to the public. We will be emphasizing the services, the reinforcing the orders, reinforcing the requirements, the safeties, etc. However, Mr. Speaker, there always would be some exemptions, and there will always be some things that people will say it's not fair. For example, compassionate exemptions. A lot of communities will call and say, why is this person self-isolating in my community, and not realize, and I won't get into some of the compassionate, but there's really serious concerns that sometimes people have to be for example, end of life with their family members. So there are exemptions that are made, and that will still happen is my expectation. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you, Honourable Premier. Final supplementary, member for Kamloops.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, this year I'm sure we'll see differences in the actuals of departments versus what they had originally budgeted for, especially, for example, in the area of, or the line item of travel. Public servants aren't traveling as much as they probably anticipated that they would. And conversely, other departments are going to have much higher line items. For example, Health and Social Services is a great example of that. They're doing a lot more rapid testing and investing in areas that they didn't anticipate having to invest in. And so what I'm wondering is, what direction has the Premier provided to GNWT departments to protect against end-of-the-year spending and to address ongoing budget concerns of if you don't spend it, you lose it, in order to be able to redirect these funds to COVID-19? Thank you.
Thank you, member for Kamloops. Honourable Premier.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The end of the year funding is not an issue new to this government. It's an issue that I think people have known about for years and complained about. When I was in the NGO world, before I came here actually, I noticed that always got contracts at the end of the fiscal year and didn't have enough time to fulfill those contracts was always an issue. So I brought that up in the 18th Assembly when I was a minister at that time, and I was assured by the finance minister in the last Assembly that they were on it and they were working, watching it. And I challenge them all the time, and I do take heart that was done. In this government as well, this has been monitored. So right now, currently, Finance is in the process of doing a detailed review of each department's second quarterly variance, after which a formal direction may be given by the Minister of Finance about unnecessary expenditures. So we're watching it, we're reviewing it. This is not something that we just started this government. It was started at least in the last government. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you, Honourable Premier. Oral questions, member for Mumphrey.
Merci, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker,
Mr. Speaker, the COVID Secretary, I have questions. I had made a previous statement. There's a lot of information that the Northwest Territories do not know about. And it is indicated that they will hire 150 new positions and $86 million towards it.
Mr. Speaker, I wish to question the Premier regarding the new COVID Secretariat that will cost us approximately $87 million total today's cost. Mr. Speaker, the COVID Secretariat abandons the government's original cost-effective COVID response in favor of burdensome bureaucracy that promises no improvement at a vastly increased expense. Mr. Speaker, would the Premier please list other options that she considered before deciding on the costly expansion of our government to form another bureaucracy in the Northwest Territories? Mr. Speaker.
Thank you, member for Mumphrey. Honourable Premier.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Absolutely. The COVID Secretariat wasn't something that just came up and we said we're going to have a new agency because we have nothing better to do. It came out of trying to do the best we could. So again, when COVID-19 struck, every single department, and again, I give nothing but credit to those employees that stood up and said, I will help to try to save our residents of the Northwest Territories. So they were doing it off the sides of their desk, some of them doing that full time and trying to do their normal jobs off the side of the desk. It was unsustainable. And the more, again, I know that I heard that we didn't talk about MLAs, we didn't talk to the Indigenous governments. As soon as COVID-19 hit, Mr. Speaker, we met regularly. EIA met regularly every single week with the Indigenous governments. We had weekly meetings every Friday. And I know that the Minister of Municipal and Community Affairs met regularly with the municipal governments as well, because I went to some of those meetings as well, Mr. Speaker. And every meeting we went to, Mr. Speaker, they said, provide more, we're scared, please help us. We want firmer, more border controls, we want more isolation, we don't want them in our communities, we need to have PPE, we're scared, tell us what to do, give us a connection. So we tried to accommodate, Mr. Speaker. And so yeah, the money did rack up. But, Mr. Speaker, we're talking about safety. And then again, Mr. Speaker, when I went to the airport I still owe an MLA some money for masks, to pick up some masks, and I had the opportunity to talk to the Border Patrol at the airports, and they were very humble, but they said to me, Premier, we can't keep it up. It's not sustainable. We're working 7 days a week. Sometimes we're working double shifts trying to do it. I heard that, Mr. Speaker. So I think that the role of this government is really to make sure that the health and safety of people comes first. And I take that seriously, my role in that. So the Secretariat is not something that came up because it was something to do. We haven't even had time to think of things to do. We've just been go, go, go. The Secretariat came up because the Indigenous governments, the people of the Northwest Territories were asking for more supports. And the people that were providing those supports said we couldn't do it. At the same time, Mr. Speaker, businesses were saying, open up the GNWT. So we had pressure that was saying, use your resources, keep the borders controlled, keep the isolation, but get back to business. and we can't do both. So we make a choice. If the Secretariat doesn't go through within this supplementary, we go back to making a choice, Mr. Speaker. Do we have business as usual, continue with these mandates, or do we focus on the Secretariat and the isolation and the border patrols? Those are tough choices I have to make. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you, Honourable Premier. Oral questions. Member for Mumphy.
Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, this is an area that obviously a lot of concern at the community level in public. I didn't hear any support from the general public or Aboriginal governments to create an $87 million Secretariat bureaucracy. $87 million could be better well spent in housing, lack of teachers, special needs, all those issues at the community level. Real issues, Mr. Speaker. It boggles me that we're creating this Taj Mahal bureaucracy. It's unthinkable. Mr. Speaker, this was not part of 22 mandates. Mr. Speaker, did we engage the public prior to the prospect of creating another form of bureaucracy for the COVID Secretariat? We'll see.
Thank you, Member for Mumphy. Honourable Premier.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The member is absolutely right. The Secretariat wasn't in our priorities or mandate, and COVID-19 wasn't in our priorities or the mandate. And I think if it was, we might have changed our priorities and our mandates. But we have what we have, so we go forward. Was the general public? So, Mr. Speaker, again, I take ownership because some things we were trying to get off, we were trying to do, everybody was scrambling to make sure we had services in place. And we knew that some of the services on our side were breaking down, things were coming really fast, the structures were not as good as they used to. And I made the wrong assumption and assumed on the other side that the structures were still the same. So we did offer to the standing committee. And in fairness, it was buried between a letter that said this is what we're doing. You know, if you'd like to see more about how we need to reorganize the structure, that I take ownership for that, that's true. But we did offer one, and it was said, we have a lot of stuff, we don't need this briefing. When it came back to me from my staff and they said we don't need the briefing, I said that doesn't make sense. How can they not need the briefing? So again, I'd say it was buried in a letter, and I think it was misinformed. So we sent another offer to Standing Committee. At that time, Standing Committee accepted it, and we presented. Normal process back in the day used to be that we would go to Standing Committee, we'd provide the documents, they'd give us feedback, we'd take it back, we'd work on it, we'd go back to Standing Committee, give the details, give and take, and then we'd go public. We didn't have the benefit of that, Mr. Speaker. The first instance of going to Standing Committee, it was live. So we didn't have a very good communications plan. We didn't go to the public yet. Out of respect, due process is that we usually work with our MLAs first. So again, I take ownership on our side, but I also say that we tried. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you, Honourable Premier. Oral questions. Member for Mumphy.
Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, tried is not good enough. Minister of Finance made a statement earlier today talking about not directly benefiting to all NWT businesses. Mr. Speaker, we can have a direct benefits to all NWT businesses if we have open-minded to boost our economy. I'll give you an example, Mr. Speaker. Imagine giving all business, there's 3,000 businesses throughout the Northwest Territories. Out of the $87 million, 87 million in my language is that's ever lots of money. Seriously, Mr. Speaker. Just imagine granting $29,000 to each business in Northwest Territories. That will cover all Northwest Territory businesses to boost our economy. That's what we should be focusing on, not this Secretariat that MAC has been doing well since March, creating another 150 positions. Premier is saying it's not new positions. Obviously, it's new positions, new created bureaucracy. Mr. Speaker, this I don't think it came like August, September. I'm sure it's been talked about. But just with the lack of engagement, consultation with the public, just boggles my mind, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, next question I do have is, how does the Premier reconcile this massive expense with an urgent, unfulfilled needs of our business sector that I spoke to earlier, that can boost our economy, that can do a lot more than what we're proposing here as a government? Merci, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you, Member for Mumfui. Honourable Premier.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. As said, you will see that the subs will be coming later, and if the members don't decide to support it, then we have to go back to doing what we can. You know, yeah, we could give 29,000, I think the member said, to every business, and not have border controls, not have isolation units, not give out PPE to our students, to our kids, our most highest risk. We can do all that, Mr. Speaker, but does it make sense? COVID-19 is raging in the South, Mr. Speaker. They're in their second wave. The numbers every day are increasing. Should we not put our isolation units and our border controls and our enforcement and our PPE for people first, Mr. Speaker? So that's the question. If MLAs think that I should stop everything else that the secretariats do and give $29,000 to each business, tell me that. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Honourable Premier, final supplementary, Member for Mumfui.
Merci, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, obviously I'm not getting anywhere with this. The Premier and the government need to start listening to the people of Northwest Territories, and the members are on the table here. We are here to make a difference. We have identified 22 mandates, and we're not here to dictate and say, well, this is good for you. I, for one, feel that our Premier is doing that to our Northwest Territories, that this is good for you, we need to do this. I totally disagree with that, the process. Mr. Speaker, again, I'd like to refer back to this Assembly identified 22 priorities to be pursued over the next 4-year term. Priorities such as increasing graduation rates, which is badly needed, a huge challenge in our communities, small isolated communities especially. Increasing affordable housing is another one. Mr. Speaker, I can go on and on without the list of 22, but I do have the last question, Mr. Speaker. What consideration has the Premier given to the effect of this $87 million expenditure on the prospects of advancing those critical priorities? Will the Premier account for these massive expenditures if it sets back those 22 priority areas? Mr. Speaker, merci.
Mumfui, Honourable Premier.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I hear the MLA. We do have priorities that we have to get on with. We have normal business that we have to get on with. When the when we first started with the COVID response, you're right, Mr. Speaker. We did not go to the public when COVID-19 hit, and the chief public health officer said, "We're shutting things down. We're tightening up." We didn't have time, Mr. Speaker, to do proper consultation with the public, to do proper consultation with Indigenous governments, municipal governments, all applicable stakeholders. We need to have those border controls now, Mr. Speaker. I'm all about stakeholder engagement. Ask any minister here. I say it all the time. But in this case, we did not have time to do proper consultation. The best we could do, Mr. Speaker, was ask all the Indigenous and municipal governments to come together and work as governments together to define how we went forward. So, yeah, I mean, there are other priorities. At this point, we have not said we're cutting any from the other priorities. That hasn't been a discussion that I've heard at our tables. We're still on track. We're still trying to do business as normal. But again, Mr. Speaker, I mean, if that is the reason that they will say, take her out, then take me out. Because health and safety is priority. And I have an obligation as the Premier of the Northwest Territories to make sure that the health and safety of our residents comes first, Mr. Speaker, and I will hold that to my end. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Honourable Premier, oral questions. The time has expired. Written questions. Written questions. Returns to written questions. Returns to written questions. Replies to Commissioner's address. Replies to Commissioner's address. Petitions. Petitions. Reports of committees on the review of bills. Reports of committees on the review of bills. Reports of standing reports of standing and special committees. Reports of standing and special committees. Tabling of documents. Minister of Finance.
I wish to table the following 3 documents. Capital Estimates 2021-2022, Northwest Territories Liquor Licensing Board 66th Annual Report 2019 to 2020, and the 66th Annual Report for 2019-20 of the Northwest Territories Liquor and Cannabis Commission. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you, Minister. Tabling of documents. Tabling of documents. Minister responsible for Environment and Natural Resources.
Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I wish to table the following 2 documents. 2019-2020 NWT Water Stewardship Strategy Progress Review Summary, NWT Cumulative Impact Monitoring Program 2019-20 Annual Report. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you, Minister. Tabling of documents. Tabling of documents. Notices of motion. Member for Frame Lake.
Merci, Monsieur le Président. I give notice that on Tuesday, October 20th, 2020, I will move the following motion. Now, therefore, I move, seconded by the member for Nuvik Twin Lakes, that table document 165-19-2, Government of the Northwest Territories Response to Committee Report 1-19-2, Report on Long-Term Post-Pandemic Recovery, Recommendations to the GNWT, table document 166-19-2, Government of the Northwest Territories Response to Committee Report 2-19-2, Report on Long-Term Post-Pandemic Recovery, Recommendations to the GNWT, and table document 167-19-2, Government of the Northwest Territories Response to Committee Report 3-19-2, Report on Long-Term Post-Pandemic Recovery, Recommendations to the GNWT, be referred to Committee of the Whole for consideration. Merci, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you, Member for Frame Lake. Notices of motion. Notices of motion. Motions. Motions. Notices of motion for first reading of bills. Notices of motion for first reading of bills. First reading of bills. First reading of bills. Second reading of bills. Second reading of bills. Consideration and Committee of the Whole of bills and other matters. Table document 137-19-2, Capital Estimates 2021-2022 with member for Nuvik Twin Lakes signature.
I'll call this committee to order. Mr. Norn, what is the wish of committee?
Madam Chair, I move that the Chair rise and report progress.
Committee agree? I will rise and report progress.
May I have the report of the Committee of the Whole, member for Nuvik Twin Lakes.
Mr. Speaker, your committee has concluded. We're done. We report progress. It's
Report of progress. Motion is in order. Do we have a seconder? Member for Yellowknife North. All those in favor? All those opposed? Motion is carried. Thank you. Stay one. Okay, third reading of bills. Third reading of bills. Mr. Clerk, orders of the day.
Orders of the day from Monday, October 19th, 2020, 1:30 p.m. Prayer, minister statements, member statements, returns to oral questions, recognition of visitors in the gallery. Acknowledgements, oral questions, returns to written questions, replies to commissioner's address, petitions, reports of committees on the review of bills, reports of standing and special committees, tabling of documents, notices of motions. Notices of motion for first reading of bills, Bill 11. Second reading of bills, consideration in committee of the whole of bills and other matters, table document 137-19-2. Report of committee of the whole, third reading of bills, orders of the day.
Mr. Clerk, this House stands adjourned until Monday, October 19th, 2020 at 1:30 p.m.